If your council or your congregation is deeply divided on this issue, you probably have some version of 3 questions on your mind. Hopefully, the first question is, what does God think of this issue? But you're probably also wondering, can any minds be changed? And does this have to divide us if we can't all agree? Whatever questions are most pressing in your council room, there's almost always one more question lurking in our experience, which is, what is the quickest way to get this over with? And I get it. We've got bigger fish to fry. Is some extended discernment and season of persuasion, or even attempt at unity, is it worth the effort? Because I won't lie, it will take a lot of effort. And a positive outcome where everybody's happy, that is not guaranteed. It's not even likely. Is it worth the time, the extra meetings, to dive into all this more deeply? Truth is, I can't answer that question of whether it's worth it for your community. That's a question for your council. You know your situation better than I do. For me, I have leaned a lot this season on Ephesians chapter 4, where Paul says to make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. Now, if you believe you've made every reasonable effort, maybe that's enough. But if you do feel called to put in the time and to make effort, maybe not every effort, but to make an effort, Next Steps Discernment can help you make the most of that time. So let's say you are willing to put in the time. You want to discern God's will. You want to see if God can bring you all to the same page. The first thing you need in any discernment is a strong foundation. The first foundation of Next Steps is that you need to want to do God's will. Honestly, it's the easiest to say and by far the hardest to actually do. The reason it's so hard is because we need God to be the one who turns our hearts so that more than anything, we actually desire to know and do God's will. Ignatius of Loyola called this state of desiring God's will, he called it holy indifference. And he didn't mean indifference in the sense that you didn't care about the outcome or you didn't care about the people affected. He meant it like Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. Not my will, but yours be done. May I hold my own desires and expectations loosely, trusting that God's will is better, even if it's different from my own understanding. This is by far the hardest part, and for most of us, this is what takes the longest. But you cannot start a Christian discernment without it. So the first foundation is that God gives you the desire to do God's will. Now, to get to the point of desiring God's will actually requires the second foundation. To desire God's will and then to maintain that desire, especially as you experience adversity or challenge, you need to spend time with God. So the second foundation is remain in Christ. And it's a reference to John chapter 15 where Jesus says, if you remain in me and I remain in you, you will bear much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing. If we want fruitful discernment, we must be connected to the living vine. That's why Next Steps recommends that both together as a congregation and alone as individuals, you invest time to be with the Lord during this process. Fasting, prayer, study, a daily examine. We recommend practices like these because God tends to use them to show us what we really desire and to help shift our desires back to God. And then the third foundation. We have to love one another. Honestly, when you're discerning hard things and you're with people you disagree with, this command to love one another, it's one of the first to go. But in Christian discernment, you can disagree. You can disagree sharply. One thing you can never do is stop loving each other. Now, in Next Steps, that love takes two practical shapes. You love each other personally by listening to one another, listening to understand, we say. That's what the listening circles are all about. But then also, your council loves your church, we say, procedurally. Loves your church procedurally by following good process. We call it fair process. All right, so you're working the spiritual disciplines. You're asking the Lord to shape your heart. What's next? Well, probably you need some information. For instance, if you're dealing with human sexuality issues, you probably start with the Human Sexuality Report. Have you read it? Have you discussed it? Are there biblical, theological, pastoral, technical details related to the issue that either you as a council or your congregation just need to know? So this could be a teaching series. It could be small group discussions. We actually have study guides for just that. The idea is you start by learning about what you're discerning. Now, once you've done some intentional learning, you may be ready for what we call stage 1 of Next Steps Discernment. In this stage, trained facilitators, and we can train them, trained facilitators and note takers host listening circles. Now, a listening circle is basically a one-off 90-minute small group. The main thing you do in these circles is you pray and you listen to each other. There's this theologian, David Augsburger, has got this great line about listening. He says that being heard, being listened to, is so close to being loved that for the average person, they are almost indistinguishable. A listening circle, yes, it's a place to get out ideas and perspectives and even opinions. But mostly, it's a place to love each other by listening to each other. And so you don't talk back. You don't really discuss in the circle. You just take turns listening. So you ask questions. In our scripts, the first few questions, they're meant to tell us, where are folks right now with respect to the issue? What are their concerns, their hopes, their questions? And then the last few questions are meant to help you find out, what people sense they need to move forward. Do they need more time? Do they need more teaching? Do they need their questions answered? What do they need? And so you listen. Now, I know that some people have used this kind of call to listen in kind of a manipulative way. It's a way to just delay. It's a stall tactic. It's a way to buy time. And that's not really what I mean. One of the things I will often say about listening is that listening does not mean agreeing. Listening does not mean giving up decision-making authority. Listening doesn't mean we're only ever going to listen and never make decisions. What listening does, real listening, is yes, it encourages deeper insight and wisdom. But most of all, listening is just a really concrete way to love another person. And so you listen. And then the recorder in each group, taking notes, collects what they heard. And you take all of that, you scrub it of identifying details, and you share a summary report back with the congregation and with the council. Now, you share it with the council because, that information is going to help them understand where the congregation is at and what they need and how they can be led. You share it with the congregation because in moments like these, anxious moments, transparency builds trust. You let the congregation know this is what we heard. Now, there are side benefits, doing this will also help people appreciate the kind of range of questions and issues and hopes and concerns in the community. And sharing it with the congregation helps the congregation realize that the council's job is harder than they might have first thought. All right, so you've been listening. Now you move to stage 2. What council tries to do now is to discern for themselves really 2 things. First, is there anything else that we need to teach? So We listened to our people. That was stage one. Now, are there gaps in people's understanding of the issues that kind of showed up in that first round of listening circles? How might we fill those gaps? And then the big question. What does the council discern to be God's will for how to move forward in this issue? And I won't lie, this may take a while. A lot of churches end up using a subcommittee to try to put flesh on this. We've got a script for how your council can try to talk about it, but at some point your council comes to some conclusions. You've wrestled with the relevant biblical teaching. You've heard the questions and concerns of the congregation. You've been prayerfully seeking God's will as a council, hopefully also as a congregation. But now you sense that, to the best of your judgment, this is the best way forward. This is God's desire for your church. Well, the next thing you do is you actually write down the fruit of your discernment and the process you took to get there. So, what has God made clear? How did God make it clear? How did you arrive at what we call in the resource your scenario for the future? Now, what you're writing down, this scenario, it really could just be as simple as a letter to the congregation. Or it could be something a little bigger, more detailed. Whatever it is, it's written down. You explain what you've decided and how. Now, the next thing you do is you share it. But at the same time you share it, we encourage you to invite folks to sign up for one more round of listening circles. So, same thing as before. You have a facilitator, a recorder. You've got a small group of members. We give you a different script with prayers and scripture and ground rules and questions. We actually explain this part in another video, so it might sound familiar. But the first question in this script at this stage is, what's one thing you affirm about council's letter? And you ask this because you hope that God provides a confirming witness of your discernment. Second, what's one thing you resist? Now, you ask this one because you know you're fallible, and there might be something you're missing or something you misunderstood. The third one, what's the hardest part for you? Now, you ask this one because in any anxious discernment or like contentious decision, what happens is relationships get strained. Community can break down, and it can be painful. It's just good to mourn with those who mourn. Fourth question, what questions do you have? You ask this one because we are not always as clear and thorough as we think we are. The fifth question, what do you wish to share with the council to help their discernment in this season? It could be a Bible verse. It could be a story. It could be a theme that came to you in prayer. You ask this because God has given wisdom and insight even to people outside of the council. And while council may not agree with what you've heard, we also dare not say we don't need you. The sixth question is, if you disagree with this scenario, what do you need to stay engaged and connected to the church? Now, I think this is a really important question. And we ask it because not every disagreement requires that we separate. Some do, but sometimes what a dissenter needs in order to stay engaged in the church is something the church is happy to provide. So for the human sexuality type discussions, maybe a dissenter says, I'm uneasy with this traditional position. I'm afraid you're just using it to draw a line and say, like, those are the bad people and those are the good people. And I don't think it's ever going to stop. I think we're just going to keep drawing tighter and tighter lines. But if I knew that our church was really committed to loving and enfolding and discipling LGBT folks, I would stick around. Now, I think most CRC councils would say, oh yeah, We'd happily do that. This isn't about bright lines of good and bad people. This is about pastoral care and discipleship. And that's it. When you ask, what do you need to stay engaged? You don't have to guess anymore how people will respond or guess what they need. You don't have to assume. Now, of course, if they ask for something the council can't or won't provide, at least now you can be honest about that, and now the council knows what's at stake. So you ask the questions. Responses to the questions, just like before, they're written down, they're collected, they're made anonymous, they're shared back with the congregation and the council, and then the council goes back to their decision. Maybe they rewrite the whole thing. Maybe they expand it, maybe they tweak it, maybe they just leave it alone. Once the feedback from the circles has been considered, the council shares their final decision with the church. They might host another set of circles if they want more engagement. They might not. But then you get to the last stage. Most churches that get to the end of a discernment process find that they just need to acknowledge that God's been present in the process. It's what we call stage 5, where, especially through worship, congregations give thanks for God's presence and leading. They might also confess ways that they hurt one another along the way. They might have to lament that maybe unanimity wasn't achieved. They might have to ask for forgiveness for giving offense. In any case, a lot of churches want to wrap up their discernment in a kind of worshipful response. And that's it. The truth is, as you can see, there's a lot of different ways to adapt this resource, to expand it or contract it, depending on the needs of your community. But we encourage you to contact us here at Pastor Church Resources to find out how Next Steps Discernment could be modified to help your community hold grace and truth together as you discern and decide next steps in an anxious season. So check us out at crcna.org/PCR/next steps.